And it's the same way with dogs, for example. The way we have the different breeds of dogs are just various traits surfacing because you have different combinations of genes. And so there's quite a lot of variation within the dog kind. Now, they're all just dogs, but we would expect that variation based on how DNA works and based on the different combinations of DNA. And so this is how you get all these different breeds of dog. And it's the same way with elephants, the way you get the different breeds of elephant, including kinds that have gone extinct, like the mammoth. But here's the point that I need you to understand. You see, an organism like an amoeba or a bacterium, something like that that is simpler than we are. And by the way, it's not simple. A bacterium is not simple. If you think it's simple, let's see you build one. They're quite complicated. But they're simpler than you are. They have fewer instructions in them because they're not required to make things like eyeballs and hands, and you have those things in your DNA. So if you think about it, a horse was going to have greater instructions, more instructions in its DNA than an amoeba would, a single-celled organism would. If evolution is true, if we're descended from bacteria, that means that information has to increase. You see, if we're descended from bacterium and we have a lot more information, at some point that information had to increase. Evolution, and I'll say it one more time because it's so important, evolution is about an increase in information in your DNA. Now that's very important to understand because the processes that we observe in nature tend to decrease the information in your DNA. Even ones that evolutionists like to say are evolution. They're really, in a way, the opposite of evolution. And let me give you one example of that. Let's talk about natural selection. A lot of people use natural selection as an example of evolution, but really, in a way, it's the opposite of evolution. Let me show you why that works. So suppose you had two dogs here, and they have a gene for long fur and a gene for short fur, and suppose those genes have a combined effect, which some genes do, and that would make the dogs have medium-length fur. Gene for long, gene for short, so they have medium-length fur. Now, this, of course, is all simplified, but the basic genetic principles here are true. And so you start with these two dogs, and they have pups. Well, some pups are going to get the short gene from dad and the short gene from mom, and they're going to end up with short fur. Some dogs are going to get the long gene from dad, the short gene from mom. They're going to end up with medium-length fur, the same as their parents. And some dogs will get long gene from dad and long gene from mom. They'll end up with long fur. Now, suppose that there's an ice age. And suppose that ice age wipes out the dogs with the short fur and the medium-length fur. Why? Because they're not as well insulated against the cold. And so the dogs that are better able to survive in that cold environment are the dogs that have the long fur. They go on and reproduce, and pretty soon all the dogs have long fur. These dogs can't reproduce because they're dead. Natural selection killed them off. Now, this is a great example of natural selection because these dogs, they've adapted to their environment. It's a great example of adaptation. And you can see why it is. The environment got cold, the dogs had long fur. But the information was there from the beginning. These dogs had the information in them for that long fur. It just wasn't expressed because they had the wrong combination of genes. But you see, if you think about it, this really isn't evolution. Because have we gained any information? Not at all. In fact, we've actually lost information. Putting it this way, if there's now a heat wave, we're now done here, all the dogs have long fur, there's now a heat wave, are those dogs ever going to go back to having short or medium-length fur? Not at all. Because they don't have the information. They've lost the information for short fur. That gene has been eliminated from them. Natural selection actually reduces information. Adaptation reduces information. In a way, it's the opposite of evolution because evolution, we said, is about increasing information. This is the exact opposite. Let's suppose you had two dogs on Noah's Ark, and they get off and get married and have kids, and their kids get married and have kids, and so on, and they have lots of pups. And some of those go off north, and some of them go south. Some of them go places where it's cold. Some of them go places where it's hot. And they adapt to their environment by natural selection, killing off the dogs that have genes inappropriate to that environment. But it's not evolution. You got dogs changing into dogs. That's not evolution. It's just dogs. And, of course, it's not an increase in information. There's no evolution here at all. It's just natural selection. And, of course, that's a creationist concept anyway. Edward Blythe wrote about natural selection long before Darwin came up with the idea of evolution, or at least popularized the idea of evolution. And so the way you end up with all these different breeds of wild dogs is just natural selection acting on the genes that God created in the dog kind. Natural selection tends to select the dogs appropriate to their environment. Okay, but what about mutations? Well, a mutation basically is a copying mistake. It's a typo in your DNA. So one of those little genes has been switched. And suppose you have a dog with genes for 4 normal legs, which all dogs should have, but there's a mutation, a copying mistake, and so that gene doesn't get copied properly. And so you end up with a dog with short, stubby little legs because his legs didn't form quite properly because he's missing a little bit of information. And that's key to understand. Mutations are really a loss of information. Now, if you think about it, dogs with lots of mutations like that would tend to be eliminated in nature, wouldn't they? A dog with short, stubby little legs is more likely to be killed off because he can't run and catch anything, and he's more likely to be picked off himself. But if you think about it, some people like dogs with short, stubby little legs because they can't jump up on you as much. And so people protect the mutations in dogs that they like. And they take dogs with short, stubby little legs and encourage them to breed with other dogs with short, stubby little legs. And you end up with lots of dogs with short, stubby little legs. See, that's how it works. And there are other mutations as well, of course. There's a mutation that causes the dog's snout not to grow properly. And so you end up with a short, stubby little snout. And the skin was designed to fit the longer snout, so the skin hangs off the side. And if you don't clean it, it can get infected. And some people like dogs with that mutation. And I'm not one of them, but in any case. But have you ever thought about it from the dog's point of view? You think he says, gee, I love having my nose stuffed into my face. That's great. Not at all. Poodles. Let's talk about poodles. Look at all the different problems that poodles can have because of mutations that have been built up in their genome. There's a mutation that causes their fur not to stop growing. See, dogs they're supposed to have fur that grows so long, but with poodles it can grow continually. And if you don't trim it, it can get in their eyes can get infected. They can have secondary problems because of some of these other problems in their DNA because of all these mutations, you see. So that's how you get these different breeds of domestic dog, just different combinations of genes and mutations accumulating in the various dog kind. But it's not evolution, because if you start with these more wild kinds of dogs, and through selective breeding, through natural and artificial selection in the case of domestic breeds of dogs, you get all the way down to the poodle. But it's not evolution because we haven't gained any information. In fact, we've lost information. Those mutations reduce information, just as natural selection does. They eliminate information. You can think of information in DNA like jelly beans. And so you start out with the more wild kinds of dogs that have more information, more possible traits. And then through inbreeding those dogs, you can reduce that information, and through mutations as well. And so you get down to the poodle, and then you have hardly any information left. You got a biological disaster on your hands. But if you think about it, could you ever turn a dog into a cat by this kind of process, by losing information? Not at all, because a cat has different information. You can't turn one kind of information into another by losing it. It doesn't work that way. So you see, evolution can't work by natural selection and mutations. You can see that because those processes only reduce information, whereas evolution is about an increase in information. So when we take a look at dogs in the world today, and we watch how they reproduce, and we see dogs giving rise to dogs, we're applying good operational, observational science in the present. We find that it's consistent with what God has said in His Word, that animals reproduce after their kind. It's consistent with creation, but it's really not consistent with what you'd expect from evolution, where we would expect an increase in the information content in the DNA. By the way, it's important to point out that mutations can be beneficial by losing information. In other words, a mutation could help you survive, but it's still not